The moment Isadora Quinn burst through the iron doors of the midnight court, she was already bleeding, not from a wound, not from a blade, but from the inside out. The kind of bleeding that happens when everything you trusted turns to ash, and the only direction left is forward. The grand hall of the Court of Crimson Accord stretched before her, all black marble and ancient chandeliers dripping with red crystal, and every single immortal face turned toward her with identical expressions of cold, predatory surprise. She did not slow down. The guards shouted behind her. She could hear them, the heavy thunder of vampire enforcers who had been chasing her through 3 underground corridors and 2 city blocks of rain-soaked London street. They were fast, impossibly, supernaturally fast. But they had not caught her because Isadora Quinn had spent the last 4 years learning exactly how fast vampires moved, exactly how they thought, and exactly how to stay one step ahead of the worst possible version of a supernatural being who wanted her dead. She was not fleeing. She needed them to believe she was. She needed every set of ancient, calculating eyes in that room to believe she was a terrified human running blindly into a trap. Because if they guessed the truth, everything would unravel before she reached the far end of that hall. "Stop her!" A voice like crushed velvet and old poison rang out from the left dais. Lord Velthanar, High Arbiter of the Crimson Accord, and the man who had signed the order to have her murdered, rose from his throne chair with the particular fluid grace that made her stomach turn. His white hair fell in perfect sheets around his angular face, his pale skin luminous under the red chandeliers, his silver eyes locked onto her like twin knife points. She carries stolen intelligence. She must not reach the inner sanctum. The hall erupted. Isadora ran harder. She had one objective, one name in her mind, blazing like a lighthouse through a storm. She had spent 6 weeks gathering evidence, 4 months gaining access, and every day of the last 2 years, building toward this singular, terrifying moment. She was not a fool. She was not panicking. She was executing the most dangerous plan she had ever designed, and it depended entirely on one man, one vampire. She hit the inner sanctum doors at full speed, and they did not open. Her palms slammed flat against the dark wood, her chest heaving. And for one cracked, terrible second, she thought she had miscalculated. She thought it was over. The enforcers were 10 feet behind her. Lord Velthanar was descending the dais steps with murder written calmly across his immortal face. The entire court of Crimson Accord was converging, and Isadora Quinn was pressed against a door that would not move. Then it opened, not inward, not outward. It simply ceased to exist as a barrier, and she stumbled forward into a room that was dark and cool, and smelled like old libraries and something she could not name, something electric and ancient. And she caught herself against a desk edge and spun around, and standing behind her, between her and the doors that had sealed themselves shut again, was Hadrian Rothbart, the Duke of Ashenvale. He was exactly as terrifying as every account had described, and somehow nothing like any of them. His white hair was longer than she had expected, swept back from a face that was sharp with authority and high with cheekbones that looked carved rather than born. His pale skin absolute and flawless in the dim light, his eyes the color of old amber gold shot through with darkness. Watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize as anything she had encountered in 4 years of studying vampires. It was not hunger. It was not contempt. It was not the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. It was complete, focused, undivided attention, as if she were the most interesting thing he had seen in several centuries, which, considering that Hadrian Rothbart had walked the earth for 840 years, was a statement of some considerable weight. "Isadora Quinn," he said, and his voice was the lowest thing she had ever heard, not loud, not performative, simply carrying in the way that mountains carry, as something that simply occupied space by existing. "I was wondering when you would arrive." She stared at him. Her lungs were burning. Behind the sealed door she could hear Lord Velthanar's voice rising with barely controlled fury, and she knew she had approximately 4 minutes before the ancient blood law governing the inviolability of a duke's inner sanctum was either overridden or the door itself was destroyed. "You knew I was coming," she said, not a question. "I knew someone would come," he replied, moving to the left side of his desk with a slow, unhurried grace, picking up a crystal glass of something dark and placing it back down without drinking. I did not know it would be a human woman with stolen court intelligence and the kind of nerve that suggests either extraordinary courage or a complete absence of self-preservation instinct. It is courage, she said immediately, because she needed him to know from the very first moment that she was not someone he could dismiss. And I need 5 minutes of your time, and then you can decide whether to hand me to Velthanar or help me burn his entire network to the ground. Something moved in those amber eyes. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had lived next to amusement for so long it had taken on a similar shape. Sit down, he said. She sat, outside the sealed door. The court of Crimson Accord raged. Isadora had first crossed the boundary between human and vampire worlds 4 years ago, and it had not been by choice. She had been 22, newly graduated from her criminology program, and working as a research analyst for a private intelligence firm in London's financial district, the kind of firm that did quietly lucrative work for clients who preferred not to leave paper trails. She had been good at her job, unusually good, the kind of good that earned her access to files no entry-level analyst should have ever seen. One of those files had contained a name, Mira Quinn. Her younger sister, age 19, reported missing by the University of Edinburgh. The police file had been perfunctory, the investigation thinner than paper, the conclusion drawn with suspicious speed. But the private intelligence file, the one buried under 3 layers of client encryption that Isadora had cracked through an accidental cascade of permissions she should not have had, that file told a different story. Mira Quinn had not run away. Mira Quinn had stumbled into the wrong part of London on the wrong night and witnessed a vampire feeding in the alley behind a theatre, which was illegal under the Crimson Accord, the ancient blood law treaty between vampire kind and the small, secret human governmental body that managed coexistence. Mira had been taken to prevent disclosure, and the vampire who had taken her was one of Lord Velthanar's inner court. Isadora had put her desk lamp through her office window, accepted that her old life was over, and started planning. She had spent the first year learning everything a civilian human could learn about vampire society without dying. She had found the edges of the network, the human intermediaries and the paid informants and the low-ranking bloodborne who traded information for money or protection. She had built a map of the Crimson Accord's structure, its power hierarchies, its blood laws, its forbidden alliances. She had learned about Hadrian Rothbart in Year 2. The Duke of Ashenvale was anomalous in vampire society in ways that made him either the most dangerous being she had ever researched or the only possible ally she could ever hope for. He was old, almost incomprehensibly old, 8 centuries of accumulated power and immortal clarity, which placed him above nearly every active court member in raw authority. He sat on no formal throne and commanded no army, but his word carried weight that made council members physically still themselves when he entered rooms. More importantly, he had opposed the Crimson Accord's newer blood laws from the moment they were codified, laws that gave inner court members the authority to silence human witnesses permanently. He had called the practice a corruption of their oldest codes. He had said so publicly in formal court session, which in vampire political terms was roughly equivalent to a human diplomat standing in Parliament and calling the Prime Minister a criminal to his face. He had not been expelled or executed because no one had the authority to touch a Duke of Ashenvale without triggering the most ancient compacts of vampire law. He was protected by 800 years of accumulated honor, which was its own kind of armor. The question that had taken Isadora the better part of a year to answer was whether his honor was real, because the obvious plan, the logical plan, the plan that every rational assessment of her situation pointed toward, was to go to Hadrian Rothbart with her evidence. But obvious plans in vampire courts had a habit of being traps, and allies who seemed powerful had a habit of using the vulnerable for their own agendas. She had needed to be sure. She had spent months testing his reputation through intermediaries, following his decisions, tracking the consequences of his actions in court disputes she could only partially observe. She had needed to know with the certainty that only direct evidence could provide whether he was genuinely what his reputation suggested. She had gotten that certainty 3 weeks ago when she had witnessed, entirely by accident while hiding in a service corridor during a court function, Hadrian Rothbart personally refusing to authorize the execution of a human informant whom Velthanar had accused of treason. He had done it quietly, no performance, no political theatre. He had simply looked at the authorization document and said, without raising his voice, that he would not sign the death of an unarmed human civilian under any current interpretation of blood law, and that if Velthanar wished to contest the point, he was welcome to bring the matter before the full ancient tribunal, which both of them knew Velthanar could not risk, because a full tribunal would expose exactly the kind of illegalities that Isadora had been documenting for 2 years. The informant had lived, and Isadora had known she had her answer. The plan she had built after that was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its danger. She needed the stolen files to be witnessed entering Hadrian Rothbart's possession. She needed Velthanar to believe she was a runaway, a frightened human blundering toward the most powerful figure she could find out of desperation rather than strategy. She needed the court to see her run, because if they thought she was acting on intelligence or operating within a larger scheme, they would be looking for co-conspirators for the wider network. If they thought she was just a desperate woman with stolen data fleeing for her life, the entire focus would remain on her alone. What she had not planned for, what she had not been able to plan for, was how it would feel to sit across a desk from Hadrian Rothbart in the actual flesh and realize that every clinical assessment she had made of him from a careful, measured distance had failed to account for what he was like in 3 dimensions. He was listening to her, not performing the act of listening, while assembling his own response. Actually listening, the way extremely intelligent people listen when they encounter something that genuinely occupies their full attention. She laid the drive on his desk. Small, matte black, the kind you could buy at any electronics shop. It contained 2 years of her life. Velthanar has been operating a systematic disappearance program, she said, keeping her voice level, keeping her hands still. He has been abducting human witnesses to accord violations and either using them as permanent blood sources in his underground facility or having them killed when they become inconvenient. There are currently 11 documented missing persons whose files I have cross-referenced with court function rosters, which places them at specific locations on specific nights where accord violations occurred. My sister is one of them. Hadrian had not moved. He was watching her with that consuming attention, one hand resting on the desk near but not touching the drive. You built this alone, he said. Yes. Over how long? 4 years. A silence stretched between them that felt different from the silence outside, where she could still hear the muffled fury of the court attempting to penetrate the sealed doors. This silence was contemplative. You know, he said carefully, that the simplest explanation for your presence here, the one every member of the Crimson Accord will accept, is that you are a terrified human who ran to the only significant power in the room. That is exactly what I need them to believe, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something that carried its weight. And the evidence on this drive, he said. Does it directly implicate Velthanar? It does more than implicate him, she said. It proves 11 counts of accord violation, 3 breaches of blood law governing human civilians, and 1 count of what your legal code designates as a hidden covenant betrayal, which, under the ancient tribunal charter, carries mandatory review by the full council and potential dissolution of his court seat. Hadrian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very level. You researched our legal code. I researched everything, she said, and she held his gaze because she needed him to understand that she was not afraid of him, not in the way prey was afraid of a predator, and that distinction mattered. I am not here because I had nowhere else to go. I am here because you are the correct move, and I do not make moves I have not thoroughly examined. Something shifted in his amber eyes, deepened. Your sister, he said. You believe she is still alive. Her composure cracked the smallest amount, just a hairline fracture barely perceptible. I have to believe that. I cannot operate on any other assumption. That is not what I asked. She met his eyes. The most recent record I have, from 8 months ago, indicates she was alive. Whether that remains true is a variable I cannot control from the outside, which is why I needed to get inside. Hadrian stood. The movement was contained and decisive, and she was suddenly acutely aware of how much physical space he occupied, not through bulk, but through presence, the kind of ancient, gathered force that existed in very old things that had survived very many storms. He picked up the drive. Lord Velthanar will not wait long before he attempts to breach this room, he said. Bloodlaw gives him approximately 40 minutes before the right of inviolability expires under emergency court protocols. After that, this becomes a political confrontation I am not unready for, but it will move quickly and it will be dangerous for you specifically. He looked at her with those steady amber eyes. Stay behind me. Those 3 words landed differently than she had expected. She had anticipated an instruction, a practical command from someone managing a tactical situation. What they felt like instead was something older and more fundamental. A declaration of position, an establishment of intent that went beyond the immediate logistics of the situation. She stood up. "What is your plan?" "My plan," he said, moving toward the sealed door with a controlled, deliberate energy, "is to open that door and walk directly into the court hall, which will confuse every single person out there, because no one expects the offense. You are going to take the confrontation to them. I am going to remind the Court of Crimson Accord that I have been waiting for exactly this moment for 3 years, he said, and that I have considerably more patience than Lord Velthanar has ever been comfortable with." He glanced back at her. "Stay close." She did. The doors opened. Lord Velthanar was standing 8 feet away with 6 court enforcers arranged behind him, and an expression of controlled fury that had clearly been carefully maintained through the past 45 minutes of waiting. The broader court had not dispersed. They were arranged in clusters across the hall, performing disinterest badly, every ancient face angled toward the opening doors. Hadrian walked out first. The immediate change in the room's atmosphere was something Isadora registered physically, a pressure shift, like the air itself was rearranging to accommodate the weight of what he carried. Velthanar's silver eyes moved from Hadrian's face to Isadora, standing at Hadrian's left shoulder, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Rothbart," Velthanar said, and even his beautiful, cultivated voice had an edge in it. "That woman is carrying stolen court property and is to be held under emergency accord authority." "Under what specific provision?" Hadrian replied, and his voice was conversational. Completely, almost insultingly conversational. Velthanar's expression flickered. "Article 7, Emergency Information Seizure." "Article 7 applies to court personnel," Hadrian said, stopping 6 feet from Velthanar and making no gesture of deference, no acknowledgement of the enforcers at all, as if they were simply furniture. "Miss Quinn is a civilian human. Article 7 has no jurisdiction over her. You would require Article 14, which mandates public cause declaration and formal tribunal notice." He tilted his head a precise fraction. "Have you filed tribunal notice, Velthanar?" The silence in the hall was extraordinary. "This is not the time for procedural theatre," Velthanar said, his voice cooling dangerously. The woman entered restricted court premises. She entered the midnight court through public access corridors, Hadrian said, which, as you may recall, you opened to human-registered contacts 3 seasons ago as part of your own expansion charter. An expansion that I opposed, as the record will show. Velthanar's silver eyes went very still. He was calculating. Isadora could see it. Reassessing, and she understood in that moment what Hadrian was doing. He was not simply blocking Velthanar. He was demonstrating, publicly, before witnesses, that every move Velthanar attempted would be met with complete, prepared, legally airtight responses that Hadrian had been building toward this moment as carefully as she had, from a different angle. "The drive," Velthanar said quietly, his gaze on the matte black rectangle in Hadrian's hand. "Yes," Hadrian agreed. "This drive is now in my possession, which under the Duke's right of evidence holding is protected by the Accord's own anti-seizure compact. If you wish to contest my right to hold it, I suggest you be very certain your own conduct will survive the scrutiny of a formal review." Velthanar was completely still for 3 seconds. "You have no evidence of any wrongdoing," he said, and the certainty in his voice had become something tighter, more performative. "I have a drive I have not yet reviewed," Hadrian said calmly. "Whether it contains anything relevant to any conduct of yours is a matter for the review process to determine. Unless, of course, you have a specific reason to be concerned about what a formal review might find." The hall was so quiet that Isadora could hear her own heartbeat, Velthanar turned and walked away. The enforcers followed. The court members dispersed slowly, like smoke breaking up after a fire, and Isadora stood in the middle of the midnight court's grand hall and let out a breath that had been building for approximately 4 years. "That was beautiful," she said quietly. "That was a delay," Hadrian corrected her, turning to look at her with those amber eyes, and she registered the slightest edge of something in them that was not quite worry but lived in its neighborhood. "Not a resolution. He will regroup. He will attempt a different approach before the night is out, and the next one will be less public." She had known this. She had planned for this. "Then we move to phase 2, she said. "Tell me your phase 2, he said. "The hidden facility," she said. "The drive has the location. We need to reach it before Velthanar has time to move the people inside. Because once they are moved, the physical evidence disappears, and it is only documentation against his word, which in Vampire Court will favor him." Hadrian studied her for a moment. "You want to go to the facility tonight," he said. "I want to go to the facility in the next 2 hours," she said. Another silence. It was becoming a pattern between them, she realized. These measured silences that were not uncomfortable, that felt less like hesitation and more like him giving genuine thought to what she had said, rather than assembling a dismissal of it. "The facility is in his territory," Hadrian said, "which means direct incursion requires either formal tribunal warrant or an independent right of action under blood law. Article 2, the Ancient Protection Clause, which grants any court member the right to extract a human who has been unlawfully held." He looked at her steadily. "Article 2 requires documented evidence of unlawful holding, which you have on that drive." "Which means you have legal standing," she said. "Which means I have legal standing," he agreed. "If I invoke Article 2 publicly, before witnesses, Velthanar cannot touch anyone involved in the extraction without himself violating court law." He paused. "It also means this becomes a formal confrontation from which there is no diplomatic retreat for either of us." She held his gaze. "I know, your sister may not be there," he said, and his voice did not soften for the blow, but it also did not deliver it carelessly. "You should be prepared for that." "I am prepared for everything," she said, and she believed it until the words were out and she heard the slight vibration in her own voice that called her a liar. Because she was not prepared for everything, she had never been prepared for the specific possibility of arriving at that facility, finding a room with no mirror in it. Hadrian saw it. She could tell he saw it from the fractional shift in his expression, that careful attention turning from analytical to something more careful and less categorizable. "Then we go," he said, and he led her out of the midnight court with the calm and the absolute authority of a man who had decided a thing and found the decision sufficient. They took his car, which turned out to be a black vehicle of a very quiet, very expensive kind, driven by a human employee named Castellan, who had clearly been in Hadrian's service for a long time, and who greeted Isadora with a nod that suggested he was accustomed to unusual passengers and remarkable circumstances. Hadrian made 3 calls on the way. Brief, precise, uninflected calls to what she gathered were legal representatives of the ancient tribunal, formally placing on record his invocation of Article 2 of the Accord's blood law and citing the drive's evidence as basis. Each call lasted under 2 minutes. Each call ended the same way, with the person on the other end confirming receipt in a voice that told her that Hadrian Rothbart invoking a formal blood law article was not a common occurrence, and that it was being taken with corresponding seriousness. When he ended the 3rd call, he set the phone down and turned to look at her in the back seat. The city moved past the windows in streaks of amber light and wet pavement, and she was aware of how close they were in the physical confines of the car, and she was aware that this awareness was not particularly professional given the circumstances, and she was also aware that cataloguing it helped exactly nothing. "You said you spent 4 years on this," he said. "Yes." "What kept you going?" he said, and it was not quite a question, more a space he was creating for an answer, if she wanted to put one there. She thought about lying. Not a dramatic lie, just a clean, self-contained one. Something about justice or principles or the abstract rightness of holding the powerful accountable. All of those things were true. None of them were the complete answer. "She is my sister," she said. "She is 23 years old, and she wanted to study literature. and she had 3 housemates she adored and a ridiculous collection of mismatched earrings. She did not deserve any of this. No, he said quietly. She did not. You have opposed these practices for 3 years, she said. I read the court records, the part that is accessible. You have been formally objecting to Velthanar's methods for 3 years, and the court has done nothing. The court, he said, and there was a very old, very contained frustration in the word, requires incontrovertible evidence placed before formal process by a party with standing. Opinion and objection, regardless of the source, carry limited weight against established power when that power has spent decades carefully insulating itself. That is why you needed someone from the outside, she said slowly. Someone who built the evidence from a position that Velthanar could not infiltrate or monitor, because his court surveillance covers his own network, not civilian human researchers, who technically do not exist in his world. You are describing a strategy that required considerable intelligence and even more considerable risk, he said. Are you saying you knew about me? She asked directly. I knew someone was building a case from outside the network, he said. I did not know who. I have known for approximately 18 months that evidence was accumulating somewhere, because Velthanar's behavior in court has been increasingly defensive in ways that only make sense if he is aware of external scrutiny he cannot locate. He paused. I was not certain the builder would reach me in time. In time. The phrase settled in her chest with an uncomfortable weight. They did not speak again for several minutes, and the silence was not strained. It was the silence of 2 people who had been moving toward the same point from different directions, and were now, for the first time, occupying the same moment together. The facility was not what she had imagined. She had built it in her mind over 2 years of indirect evidence as something obviously sinister, something that announced its nature. It was in fact a converted warehouse in East London, the kind of building that looked thoroughly unremarkable from the street, a commercial property with a small logistics company registered to a shell corporation at its street address. Everything clean and documented and exactly boring enough to avoid attention. Hadrian stood on the pavement outside it and looked at it for a moment, and she saw something cross his face that was neither dispassion nor performative anger, but something older and colder. Genuine disgust, she realized. The particular disgust of someone who had stood for something for a very long time and was looking at the precise shape of the violation of it. How many entrances does your intelligence show? He asked. 3 usable, she said. 2 controlled by Velthanar's security personnel, and 1 in the lower level that is automated, but carries a code cycle. I have the base code from the drive, but I do not know when the cycle last updated. It does not matter, he said. We are not using the lower entrance. He walked to the front door. She might have said something about subtlety or tactical approach, but she had decided to trust his judgment in his domains the same way she would have wanted him to trust hers. And so she kept up with him and watched. He did not knock. He did not attempt concealment. He walked to the front door and placed his hand against it. And she felt the air shift, that electric ancient charge she had noticed in his office, and the lock disengaged with a clean, quiet click. The 2 security personnel inside the entrance corridor had approximately 3 seconds between seeing who had walked through the door and the moment they found themselves immobilized by something she understood in retrospect was a concentrated exercise of very old psychic dominance, the kind of ability that developed in vampires who had accumulated centuries of focused power. She had read about it theoretically. Seeing it in practice was a different thing. Stay close, he said again, and moved through the corridor with that same controlled, decisive stride. They found Velthanar's holding area in the sub-level, behind a door that required both a code and a biometric. Hadrian bypassed through a method she filed away for future analysis. The room behind it was large and had been divided into living spaces of a kind, not cells exactly, but clearly not free quarters either, and there were 9 people inside it, 9 people. Her documentation had identified 11 missing persons. 2 of the 11 she knew from her most recent intelligence had been confirmed dead. 9 people who had stumbled into the wrong alley, or the wrong conversation, or the wrong version of a London night, and had been here since then, living in this climate-controlled limbo under fluorescent lights, while Velthanar continued attending court functions, Isadora walked into the room before Hadrian finished clearing the entrance, which she knew was not tactically perfect, but was also something she was completely incapable of controlling. Because 3 seconds after she crossed the threshold, she saw a woman sitting against the far wall with her knees drawn up and a book open in her lap. A woman with her same dark hair and their mother's particular jaw, and 3 mismatched earrings visible from the doorway. Mira Quinn looked up. The sound Isadora made was not something she would later be able to describe accurately. It was not a word. It was the particular sound a person makes when something they have held tightly for 4 years and believed in through every rational argument against it, finally proves itself true. She crossed the room in 4 strides, and Mira was on her feet before she got there, and then her sister was in her arms, and they were both crying with the ungraceful, complete honesty of people who have stopped performing composure for each other, and Isadora held her and breathed and felt 4 years of controlled fear performing its delayed collapse. "You came," Mira said, muffled against her shoulder. "I said I would," Isadora said, which was not true because she had never been able to contact Mira to make the promise, but it was the truest thing she had ever said. She was aware, from a warm peripheral part of her attention, that Hadrian was standing at the room's entrance watching this with an expression she could not read, but that carried no impatience, no urgency, giving her these uninterrupted seconds as if he understood exactly what they cost and exactly what they were worth. Then he said, quietly, "We should move." She stood up. Mira stood up. Isadora kept one hand firmly on her sister's arm. All of them?" she asked, meaning the 9 people in the room. "All of them," he said, without hesitation. And the absolute lack of hesitation in those 3 words did something to Isadora's understanding of him, that she filed quietly and did not examine immediately because there was no time, and also because examining it would have required more composure than she currently had available. Getting 9 civilians out of a sub-level holding facility in East London while Velthanar's network was undoubtedly being alerted was a complex logistical endeavor that Hadrian Rothbart managed with a quiet efficiency that told her this was not his first extraction. Castellan arrived with 2 additional vehicles within 12 minutes. Hadrian made one more call, brief, to what she gathered were tribunal representatives again, formally notifying them that he was in the process of executing an Article 2 extraction of 11 documented victims, which created an immediate legal record that Velthanar could not erase or contest without a tribunal hearing he was not prepared for. Velthanar himself did not appear. She thought about this in the second vehicle on the way back toward the court's legal district, Mira asleep against her shoulder, with the blunt honesty of someone who had not slept properly in months. And she thought that Velthanar's absence was either tactical restraint or the specific calculation of a man who understood that the window for physical intervention had closed and was now repositioning for the legal confrontation to come. She said as much to Hadrian, who was in the front seat beside Castellan. He turned to look at her, and the city lights crossing his face in intervals made him look very old in the most compelling way, the way old paintings looked, containing layers. "He will challenge the evidence's chain of custody," Hadrian said. "He will argue that a civilian collected it illegally, that it is inadmissible under court protocols." "It is not inadmissible under Article 17, she said, because she had known this would be his approach, and she had spent considerable time on Article 17. Article 17 explicitly covers civilian-gathered evidence in cases of blood law violation, because the court recognized historically that internal evidence gathering in those cases was inherently compromised. The provision exists specifically to allow external documentation. Hadrian was quiet for a moment. "You really have read everything," he said. "I had 4 years, she said. "Most people with 4 years to spend would have gone to the human authorities," he said, "or given up. The human authorities," she said, "have a small, underfunded, semi-secret liaison office with the vampire courts that is almost entirely dependent on vampire court cooperation to function. Bringing them an accusation against a senior court member without ironclad evidence would have resulted in quiet disposal of the case, and significantly less quiet disposal of me." She paused. "And I do not give up. No," he said, and his amber eyes held hers for a moment that lasted slightly longer than functional communication required. I can see that. The formal tribunal hearing was convened 48 hours later, and it was the most extraordinary thing Isadora had ever witnessed, which was a high bar considering recent events. The full ancient tribunal of the Crimson Accord met in a chamber beneath the Midnight Court that was 300 years older than the court itself. All black stone and iron, and the accumulated weight of century upon century of vampire law and negotiation and immortal politics. The tribunal members were older than anyone Isadora had encountered in the court above. Old enough that their faces carried the particular quality of people who had stopped being urgent about anything, because they had seen urgency exhaust itself against the permanence of time. Hadrian presented the evidence with the same quiet, thorough precision she had come to associate with him in the past 48 hours of constant proximity, and she noted that the tribunal members watched him with the particular attention of entities who had known him for a long time and had learned not to underestimate him. Velthanar's legal representatives made the anticipated arguments about evidence admissibility, chain of custody, civilian interference, and the questionable presence of a human in a court legal matter. Hadrian answered each argument with the prepared, airtight, Article 17 grounded responses that he and Isadora had spent the previous night constructing together at his desk in the Ashenvale residence, where she had spent 40 hours under his formal protection, which under vampire law meant that touching her required going through him and the 3 centuries of accumulated blood law precedent that backed his authority. The 48 hours had been productive in the legal preparation sense and distracting in every other sense, because she had been sitting across from Hadrian Rothbart at a desk strewn with evidence files and ancient law volumes for 48 hours, and had discovered progressively and somewhat inconveniently that he was exactly the kind of person she found most compelling. He listened, he thought before he spoke. He did not perform certainty but carried actual clarity, and those were different things, and the difference mattered enormously to her. He asked her opinion on legal strategy, not as courtesy, but because he genuinely wanted her perspective, and when her perspective changed his thinking, he acknowledged it directly without ceremony. On the second night, around 3 a.m, when the tribunal preparation was complete and they were sitting in his study with cold coffee and the particular tiredness that sets in after sustained high-stakes concentration, he had looked at her and said, "How are you holding up?" And the question was so direct and so without performative concern that she had not deflected it as she would have deflected a more carefully phrased version. "I am holding up," she said. "I am better than I was 72 hours ago. Mira is safe." She paused. "That was the load-bearing wall. Everything else is manageable." "The tribunal may not find in your favor," he said. "Velthanar has 800 years of political capital invested in this court. Even with the evidence, the outcome is not guaranteed." "I know," she said, "but the evidence is public record now. The documentation is filed with the tribunal registry. Even if Velthanar survives this hearing, he cannot continue operating the program. The exposure alone dismantles the practical function." He studied her for a moment. "You would accept that outcome? Accountability without complete resolution?" She thought about it honestly. "I would not prefer it. But I would accept it, because it is better than the alternative, and because pragmatism is the only ethics that actually protects people." She met his eyes. "Would you accept it?" "No," he said simply. "I have waited 3 years for this, and I will not accept a partial resolution." She looked at him, and something that had been accumulating in small increments for the past 48 hours pressed forward without her entirely deciding to let it. "Why does it matter to you so much? It is not your family. It is not your exposure. You opposed this in court for years before I arrived. What drives that?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, or might answer with the kind of persistent statement that intelligent people used when they wanted to appear to be answering without actually revealing anything. "I have lived 840 years, he said, "and in that time I have watched every variation of what happens when power convinces itself that the weak are negligible. I have watched it among humans, and I have watched it among my own kind. It begins with the same argument, that the powerful have rights the powerless do not. That protection is a gift contingent on usefulness, rather than an obligation contingent on existence." He paused. "I am not an idealist. I am not naive. I am simply someone who has lived long enough to observe the end of every single iteration of that argument, and it is always the same. It always ends in the same catastrophe, and I find I lack the patience to watch it play out one more time, when I have the standing and the ability to interrupt it." She held his gaze for a long moment in the quiet of his study. "That," she said, "is the best answer I have ever heard from any person, human or otherwise." The corner of his mouth moved in that way she had come to identify as his closest approach to an unguarded expression. "You set a very high bar," he said. "I do." She agreed, and she was smiling, and she was aware of it, and she did not particularly want to stop. The tribunal found against Velthanar on 7 of the 11 counts. 3 of the remaining 4 were deferred to secondary review pending additional procedural verification, which was the tribunal's way of requiring more time without dismissing the substance. The 11th count, the one Isadora had documented least thoroughly because she had had the least access to its evidence trail, was dismissed on procedural grounds. It was not a complete victory. Hadrian had been right about that possibility. But 7 counts of blood law violation against a senior court member triggered mandatory suspension of court authority, formal removal from the Accord's inner council, and referral to the ancient compact of punitive measures, which was vampire law's version of criminal consequence for those who carried enough history to fall under its jurisdiction. Velthanar did not accept the finding quietly. In the moments after the tribunal's declaration, his expression went through several layers of controlled catastrophe before settling into something that looked like a man reassembling, a version of himself that could survive what had just happened. He looked at Isadora once, directly, and the look contained such old and precise fury that she felt it as a physical thing. Then he looked at Hadrian. Hadrian looked back at him, and the amber eyes were steady and absolutely without apology. And the silence between them contained 800 years of opposing forces, finally arriving at their conclusion. Velthanar left the tribunal chamber. Isadora let out a breath. She became aware of Hadrian standing very close to her left side, close enough that she could feel that particular charge he carried, that ancient electric presence, and she looked up at him and found him already looking at her. 7 counts, she said. 7 counts, he confirmed. The deferred 3 will complete, she said, because she was already thinking about what additional documentation she could build for the secondary review. They will, he said, and the suspended authority means he cannot touch anyone connected to this case without triggering automatic full tribunal response, she said. Correct. So Mira is safe, she said, and those 3 words did to her composure what 4 years of calculated discipline had been preventing, and she felt the slight, involuntary tightening across her chest that preceded losing her very careful grip on herself. She is safe, he said quietly. And the others, she said, meaning the 8 people who had been in that facility who were not her sister. The tribunal has entered formal protection status for all 9, he said. Velthanar cannot approach them. She nodded again. She blinked several times very quickly and redirected her attention to the middle distance. Isadora, he said. She looked at him. You may stop now, he said gently. And what she understood him to mean was not that she should stop working or stop thinking, or stop being the person who had built a 4-year case against an ancient vampire court power in complete isolation. What he meant was that the emergency was over, that the part that required her to hold everything together with both hands at all times had ended, and that she was permitted, in this precise moment, to be human. She laughed, which surprised her, and then she pressed her hand briefly against her own sternum, as if checking that everything was where she had left it. I am genuinely not sure how to do that, she said honestly. I know, he said. I will help you figure it out. She looked at him again, really looked at him, and she found that the clinical assessment she had built of him over 2 years of careful distance had been accurate in its facts and completely inadequate to the reality of him. The way a map of a city is accurate to its facts and completely inadequate to what it feels like to live there. She was 26 years old. She had spent 4 years of her life entirely consumed by one objective. She was standing in a vampire tribunal chamber in the basement of a building that was not supposed to exist, next to an 800-year-old duke who had, over the course of 72 hours, been willing to risk his standing his legal capital, and his personal authority to help her accomplish something she had built alone, and asked him to execute at the last possible moment. She thought, with the particular clarity that follows surviving a thing you were not entirely certain you would survive, that she was not anywhere near done with Hadrian Rothbart. The weeks that followed were quieter than she had expected, which was itself a kind of testament to how thoroughly the tribunal outcome had shifted the balance of the Crimson Accord's internal politics. Velthanar's suspension from court authority was not, as some of his supporters seemed to have anticipated, a temporary embarrassment from which he would quickly recover. The secondary tribunal review completed within 3 weeks, and the deferred counts were upheld on all 3, bringing his total violations to 10 of 11. The ancient compact of punitive measures convened for the first time in 40 years and issued a formal sentence of isolation, which in vampire terms meant removal from all court function, all network access, and all accord protections for a period of 2 centuries. He would not be executed, because vampire law reserved execution for violations of a different order, but he was, effectively, removed from the world he had inhabited. It was a result Isadora examined with the same honest pragmatism she applied to everything. It was not what she would have designed if she had been building the justice system herself. But it was comprehensive. It was permanent in any human meaningful sense of the word, and it meant that the program of abductions was definitively ended, and those responsible for it were definitively accountable. She found she could live with it. Mira was recovering with the combination of resilience and occasional fragility that characterized genuine psychological recovery rather than its performance. She was living with Isadora in a flat in North London, which Isadora had rented with the particular relief of someone establishing a base of operations in a world that had finally stopped being a battlefield. Mira had resumed contact with her university, was considering whether to return to her literature degree, was sleeping better, was eating real meals, was occasionally calling her mismatched earrings a form of psychological therapy, which made Isadora simultaneously laugh and feel something so warm it was almost painful. Isadora herself was figuring out, with some difficulty, what came next. She had met with the Human Governmental Liaison Office, who had received her documentation and evidence package with a mixture of genuine gratitude and barely concealed astonishment that a civilian had assembled this level of casework. There were discussions about a formal consultant role, about a new documentation framework for civilian evidence in vampire accord cases. She had attended 3 meetings about it. She was interested. She was also aware that nothing about the landscape of vampire-human relations was fixed, and that what she had done once was now something she knew how to do, which was a skill with both obvious value and obvious cost. She had seen Hadrian twice in the weeks since the tribunal, both times in formal contexts. Brief meetings about the secondary review documentation and the final legal filings. Both meetings had been entirely professional and also entirely distracting in the way that professionalism attempted and failed to fully contain when there was something else present in the room. On the 3rd week, she received a formal invitation to dinner at the Ashenvale residence, written on paper in a hand she did not need to be told was his, because it was the hand of someone who had been writing things that mattered, in the particular way of someone who understood that words are either carried carefully or not worth writing. She accepted. The Ashenvale residence in Chelsea was not what she had expected, though by this point she should have stopped expecting Hadrian Rothbart to match her expectations. It was a large Georgian house behind locked gates on a quiet street, and inside it was a layered accumulation of 800 years of careful curation, every room carrying centuries of choices made by someone with exceptional taste and genuine curiosity about the world. Books everywhere, not for display but for use, opened and marked and clearly reread. Art that ranged from medieval to contemporary, without apparent hierarchy, selected on principles she could only guess at. And everywhere that particular quality she associated with him, that gathered, precise, ancient attention. He met her at the door himself, which she had not expected, because a man of his standing in vampire society typically had intermediaries for that function. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she replied, and the echo of what Mira had said to her in the facility was deliberate, and he heard it, because nothing she said ever slipped past him. They had dinner, which for a vampire hosting a human meant that he sat across from her with a glass of something that was not wine, and they talked for 3 hours with the freedom of people who no longer had an emergency requiring every available mental resource and could therefore simply talk. She learned things about him that the records and the court documents and the 2 years of careful research had not captured. The particular books he returned to across the centuries because they had said something true that did not expire. The way he thought about time, not as a human thought about time, as a resource that ran out, but as something that accumulated, so that he carried every version of every year he had lived in simultaneously. And the present was not a replacement of the past, but a continuation of it. The things he'd witnessed that he would not describe in detail, but that had permanently altered his understanding of what power was for, and he learned things about her. The flat in Edinburgh, where she had grown up, all argument and cooking smells, and the particular organized chaos of a family, that was too loud and not loud enough in exactly the right ways. The way she thought about problems, methodically, and then intuitively, the two modes running parallel until one outpaced the other, and she trusted whichever arrived first. What she had wanted to be before she knew what she was going to have to become. At the end of the evening, standing in the hallway with her coat and her own particular version of emotional honesty pressing against the inside of her chest, she looked at him and said, "I did not come to you purely as a strategic calculation." He was very still. "I know," he said. "I mean," she said, and she was not going to retreat into qualification. She had spent 4 years being brave in cold circumstances, and she was not going to fail at it in warm ones. That you were the right strategic choice. You were also the person I spent 2 years building a picture of and thinking, very frequently, that if the picture was accurate, I would very much like to know the actual person. "And is the picture accurate?" he asked, and his voice was very quiet and completely steady. "Imperfect in the usual ways that representations are imperfect," she said. "The actual person is more than the picture." He took one step toward her, which, given the size of his presence, meant the hallway became considerably smaller. "Isadora," he said, and her name in his voice was different from every other time he had said it. Or rather, all the times he had said it had been building toward this version, the one that carried no formality or strategy or professional distance. "Yes," she said, meaning it to answer whatever he was about to ask. He studied her face for a long moment with those amber eyes, and she had the sense that he was checking something, or rather asking something that was not quite words yet, confirming that what he was reading was real. "I have watched a great deal of the world in 840 years, he said. "I have been wrong about most of it at some point. I am rarely wrong twice about the same thing." He paused. "I am not wrong about you." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was cool and still and completely perfect, and the amber eyes went very still and warm, all at once in a way that made her chest ache with the specific ache of things that were finally exactly right. He covered her hand with his, which was the most careful thing she had ever felt, and they stood like that in the quiet hallway of his 800-year-old home, and she thought that this was what it felt like to arrive somewhere. He kissed her very carefully. Then not carefully at all. Later, much later, sitting in his library with the fire and the old books and the kind of companionable quiet that required years to build, and they had somehow built in weeks, she said, "You know this is complicated. Everything worth anything is complicated," he said. "My world and your world are not naturally compatible," she said. "There will be people who object. There will be court politics involved. There will be the question of what this means in terms of vampire law and human convention, and about 47 different kinds of precedent." "Yes," he said. "You are entirely unconcerned," she observed. "I have 840 years of experience with complicated situations," he said, "and I have observed that the complications which accompany things that are genuinely right are categorically different from the complications which accompany things that are genuinely wrong. The first kind are navigable. The second kind compound." "Which kind is this?" she asked. "The first," he said with complete certainty, and reached over and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear with the same careful, deliberate precision he applied to everything. And she leaned into his hand because she wanted to, and because she had earned the right to want things that were good without immediately cataloguing the associated risks. The months that followed built themselves around this new center, with the particular organic logic of two people who were genuinely suited to each other, discovering all the specific ways in which that was true. Isadora took the consultant role with the Human Liaison Office and expanded it into something considerably more substantial, building a formal framework for civilian evidence in vampire accord cases that had the practical effect of making the court's previously invisible operations consistently documentable. It was work that required the same methodical intelligence and honest pragmatism she had always brought to everything, and it was work that mattered in the specific way that she found most compelling, concretely, measurably, continuously. She also continued, quietly and consistently, to learn the vampire world from the inside, a process that Hadrian facilitated with the same unhurried, thorough approach he brought to everything. He introduced her to the older parts of vampire society that did not orbit the politics of the Crimson Accord, the scholars and the historians, and the few ancient beings who had long since stopped participating in court power structures and spent their centuries on intellectual pursuits and the kind of patient observation that was only possible when you had enough time to watch things fully complete. She found she liked most of them enormously. Mira recovered fully, which was a gift of a kind that defied measurement. She returned to her literature degree, which she was completing at University College London to remain close to Isadora, and she had met Hadrian on a Sunday afternoon in Isadora's flat with the combination of caution and unfiltered perceptiveness that characterized her, and she had spent approximately 40 minutes talking to him about 18th century epistolary novels before announcing to Isadora in the kitchen, in a voice quietly below vampire hearing range, that she approved entirely and that Isadora had excellent taste. Isadora had laughed for longer than the joke strictly warranted, but the laugh contained 4 years of rethink everything that had preceded it, and Mira understood that without needing it explained, Hadrian had also, she discovered, been paying attention to Mira's situation well before the formal tribunal conclusion. The 8 people from the facility who were not her sister had been placed under a formal protection structure that he had personally arranged and continued to monitor, not as a court obligation, but as an extension of a principle he had articulated to her once as simply as he articulated everything important: that the people harmed by a wrong were owed something beyond the ending of the wrong. She had not told him that was one of the things she loved about him, not yet, because she was still accumulating the full understanding of it. The way you accumulate understanding of a landscape slowly when you are walking through it rather than flying over it, on a night in late autumn. 7 months after she had run straight across the black marble floor of the midnight court, and changed both their lives with it, they were sitting at the window of his study, watching the city below in its permanent amber light, and she turned to look at him with the specific comfort and clarity of someone who knows the person they are looking at very well and is glad of it. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her with those amber eyes that she had come to know in all their variations, the sharp, focused version, and the quiet, careful version, and the version he used only with her that she thought of as the unguarded one. "I love you," she said. Not strategically and not because of what happened and not as a conclusion to a process, just genuinely and entirely. He was quiet for a moment, and she felt completely calm in the quiet because she knew him well enough to know that his quiet was not avoidance. "I know," he said, and it was not arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who paid very close attention and had been paying it for 7 months. "I have known for some time, and," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and his thumb traced a slow arc across her knuckles in the way he did when he was being particularly deliberate. "I love you with the full weight of what that means for something that has been alive as long as I have," he said. "Which is, I should warn you, considerably more than the usual amount." She felt the warmth of it all the way through. "I can manage considerably more than the usual amount," she said. "I know you can," he said, and the smile that crossed his face was the complete version, the one she had been compiling fragments of for months and now had in full, and it was extraordinary. "There is still the question of the future," she said. because she was always going to be the person who looked directly at the difficult question rather than around it. The specific nature of the future, given that you are immortal and I am not. Yes, he said, and he was not dismissing it, just holding it steadily alongside everything else. I am not asking for a decision, she said carefully. I am saying it is a question that will need to be addressed at some point, and I would rather it be between us, openly, than quietly managed around. You are right, he said, and the answer, when we reach the moment of it, will be yours to make as much as mine. He met her eyes. I have lived 840 years, and the greatest portion of that time I lived, because time continued. If I have a choice in what the next portion looks like, I would like it to look like this, whatever form this takes. She thought about that. She thought about it with the same honest, thorough attention she brought to every problem that genuinely mattered. Then we build toward it, she said, carefully and together and with full information. Yes, he said, carefully and together. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he turned his head slightly and pressed his mouth against her hair, and the city below them continued its amber motion, indifferent and gorgeous and perpetually alive. And Isadora Quinn sat in the presence of the person she had found at the end of the most difficult and consequential thing she had ever done, and felt, with complete and grounded certainty, that this was a beginning. Not the precarious beginning of something uncertain, but the solid beginning of something that had already proven it could withstand a great deal, and had chosen, having withstood it, to continue. The Crimson Accord continued. The liaison office expanded. Mira graduated with honors and wore 4 mismatched earrings to the ceremony. The 9 people from the facility rebuilt their lives in the quiet, incremental way that people rebuild lives when extraordinary recedes and the ordinary reasserts itself as what it always was, which is sufficient. Velthanar remained in his enforced isolation, a ghost of court politics rather than a participant in them. His long tenure ended not by the violence he had practiced, but by the documentation and the blood law he had believed himself above. And on a winter evening, in the library of a house that had stood for 3 centuries and now contained the combined weight of 800 years of one man's accumulated life and the considered, deliberate, absolutely clear-eyed choice of one woman who had spent 4 years running toward a truth she was not willing to leave unclaimed, Hadrian Rothbart looked at Isadora Quinn and said quietly that he had a question. She already knew the answer. She said yes before he had finished asking it. Later, she would think about that moment and what it represented, not the romance of it, though it was that, and not the resolution of it, though it was that too, but the simple, complete, extraordinary fact that she had looked at a thing most people would have considered impossible, and she had built a path through it, brick by careful brick, and arrived here on this specific evening, in this specific life, with this specific person who was looking at her with amber eyes full of 800 years of accumulated certainty that she was the precise, irreplaceable, permanent exception to every calculation he had ever made about what his life would continue to be. She was. She knew she was. She had known it from the moment he had said, "Stay behind me," in a sealed room with a court full of enemies at the door, and she had felt the weight of it settle, that particular weight of something that does not ask you to be less than you are in order to keep you safe, that holds you close and holds you whole, and considers both to be entirely compatible. Outside, London moved through its perpetual amber night, and inside, everything was exactly what it had chosen to become. Which was everything?